Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for this evening's program. I'm Christina Linden, the Director of Academic and Public Programs here at the Cantor. And before we continue, I would like to just take a moment to acknowledge that Stanford sits on the ancestral land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe.
Stanford sits on the ancestral lands of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe.
This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people.
Consistent with our values of community and inclusion,
We have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible
the university's relationship to Native peoples.
Thank you. And I'm really delighted this evening to welcome Tiffany Sia for the distinguished lecture in Asian art in honor of the Lijin Collection, and to welcome faculty members Pavle Levi and Gordon H. Chang, who will join Tiffany in conversation. If you have not yet had the opportunity to view the two works on view in the exhibition Tiffany Sia, No Place, it is upstairs in the Lynn Krywick Gibbons Gallery, and I would love for you to know that the museum will be open until 8 p.m. tonight. So we hope you can stay to visit after the conversation tonight. If you walk back towards the main lobby, as soon as you hit Marble, there is an elevator on your left. If you take that elevator upstairs to the second floor, when you exit, you'll be directly opposite the gallery in which the work's on view. So it's pretty easy to find. If you can't stay tonight, the exhibition will be on view through August 24th, so I hope you'll come again. I first saw Tiffany's work, the work that's on view upstairs, in New York in June last year, and there were several things that really drew me to the work. I think first and foremost an interest in thinking about how to represent something that's lost or missing, an interest in representing maybe a place that doesn't exist, except possibly in the imagination, a history which maybe like all histories, as we were discussing yesterday, can't be fully reconstructed, a memory with gaps, and the process of kind of evoking imagination while drawing some attention to the form of these absences and gaps, or the forms of how we might represent those, the forms that are inherent in the processes of representing those gaps. We'll hear from Tiffany first with a short artist talk, and then Pavle Levi will be joining us. Pavle is the chair of the Department of Art and Art History at Stanford and the Osgood Hooker Professor of Fine Arts in the Art Department's Film and Media Studies program. Through frequent correspondence, I've learned, as well as a shared interest in the interstitial, the elliptical, the imaginary signifier in avant-garde cinema practice, he's become a collaborator of Sia's and is listed as such in the credits for A Child Already Knows, which is one of the two works on view upstairs. These interests are also notably among the devices discussed in his 2012 book, Cinema by Other Means, and he's presented Sia's work as a particular instance of landscape cinema by other means. Gordon H. Chang is professor of history and Olive H. Palmer Professor in Humanities at Stanford University. He's the author of Ghosts of Gold Mountain, the epic story of the Chinese who built the Transcontinental Railroad, among many other important books. And we are, I think, very much looking forward to the release next month of his forthcoming volume, War, Race, and Culture, Journeys in Trans-Pacific and Asian American Histories, from Stanford University Press. The title of the exhibition upstairs and of this talk, No Place, emerged from a dinner conversation between Chang and Sia. And I think we're also just really wonderfully privileged to have Gordon's perspective on some of the histories that are among those that Sia's working on evoking with these films. So Tiffany, we will hear a lot from, so I won't go into great detail, but she's an artist, filmmaker, and writer based in New York. Wonderful read if you have a chance to pick up her recent publication, On and Off-Screen Imaginaries, a book that was published by Primary Information. Tiffany's here for a couple of weeks, and I'm extra excited to be discussing with quite a few art and art history graduate students tomorrow in a colloquium some of the writing from that book. And next week to meet with students from the music department, from the undergraduate film department, and just to have some rich conversations about this work and about Tiffany's practice at large. Oh, I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge Vinnie Chang, who established the Distinguished Lecture in Asian Art in honor of the Lijin Collection, and to thank you so much, Vinnie, for your support. And lastly, I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. Excited for this conversation, and I'm going to hand this over to Tiffany.
I'm deeply honored to be here today for the opening of my exhibition, No Place. Thank you so much to the incredible team at the Cantor Arts Center at Stanford for your immense support in the realization of this exhibition. Christina Linden, Veronica Roberts, Vivian Sming. I'm trying very hard to make eye contact with these lights. And Kwangmi Rowe, Sarah Fryer, Elisa Pritchardman Alexander, and Marcy Kwan. My sincere thanks as well to Lily Wong Sugrim and Brooks Manbeck for their tremendous work on the installation and all its logistics. Thank you also to Vinnie Chang for making this speaker series possible. I'm so grateful for all your support, collaboration, and the ongoing dialogue with this staff and faculty I admire so much. To mark this occasion, it's truly a dream to bring together Gordon H. Chang and Pavle Levi for this conversation. Thank you both for being here and for obliging me and being my interlocutors this evening. No Place, my single gallery exhibition currently on view upstairs in the Gibbons Gallery here at the Cantor, I guess we're on the same level of it, at the Cantor, centers on two twinned works. A Child Already Knows is a short film recounting a child's version of an escape from Shanghai, a blurred and adapted retelling of a personal family story. Half-remembered scenes from a moment on the cusp of history are layered with a montage of appropriated early Mao-era children's animations from the same period. Journey from North to South, a road movie presented across a 3-channel rack mount monitor, follows a 22-hour drive through interstate highways. It partly traces the Mississippi Delta, pausing at a Chinese cemetery in Greenville before ending in Biloxi at the Gulf Coast. These works were originally part of my solo exhibition, Technical Difficulties, presented at Maxwell Graham in New York in May 2024. There, they were accompanied by a third piece, An Image on Air, a video sculpture that reinterprets surtitle bars, typically used in live opera to translate dialogue. Installed in a gallery window, the piece offers a silent 2-minute captioned description of public figures, media theorist Marshall McLuhan and Fred Rogers, or better known to us as Mr. Rogers, who, 20 years apart, reflect on the experience of being on air during live broadcasts. The work imagines them in dialogue, in collision across time. Using the gallery window as a kind of live cinema, the captions play over the unscripted scene of the street outside, inviting the viewer to imagine McLuhan and Rogers performing on an unseen stage. An Image on Air, the ghostly third work not shown in this exhibition, but realized only now for this talk, opens this evening's presentation. disposition of the body on camera, delicate, wavering, on air, as McLuhan once described in one of his final television appearances before his death in 1980, offers a vision of the self dissolving under the gaze of the omnipresent state power. 45 years later, as surveillance intensifies and media circulates with unprecedented speed, the camera has become not just a tool for visibility, but a mechanism for dispossession. Especially at the front lines of resistance, filmmaking becomes a fraught act. An image, a video, is at once evidence as it is a legal snare. These thoughts on image making and surveillance, which I had originally formulated in 2022 on the works of the anonymous collective, the Hong Kong Documentary Filmmakers, still haunt me. Yet moving away from the present, at the core of both A Child Already Knows and Journey from North to South, was a desire to telescope into the more distant past, not in search of nostalgia, but to locate unfinished and fragmentary lessons from another era that echo today. So I ask, under what conditions and at what cost does the personal remain political in the age of surveillance, when personal stories become commodities in the content economy, when the rights of individuals shift in the absence of legal digital protections? When breaking silence no longer guarantees change, can we instead interrogate how the private and public spheres have been violently reconfigured, precisely as McLuhan predicted? Quote, when you're on the telephone or on radio or on TV, you don't have a physical body, you're just an image on air. When you don't have a physical body, you're a discarnate being. You have a very different relation to the world around you, unquote. A Child Already Knows is the most personal film I've ever made, and I was ambivalent about making it. To offer a personal narrative to the public felt risky, but the story reveals the origin of my own interest in history. As a child, privy to adult secrets, I became preoccupied with the Cold War. But those stories, shaped by my family's experience, often felt distant from the dominant Cold War narratives, especially its prevailing Euro-American paradigms. The film revisits my father's retelling of an escape from Shanghai in 1958, disguised as a family train journey through the South, a family vacation. Lacking personal photographs or avoiding traditional reenactments through documentary, I used animations from early Mao-era children's films, interrupted throughout with intertitles. These fragmentary visuals invite the viewer to conjure the missing images. A child watching his father sell his coat at a pawn shop. A child eating vanilla ice cream in a banquet hall at the Chinese-Soviet Friendship Mansion. A child on a train pretending their escape was a vacation. I wanted to induce the viewer into a state that film scholar Jean Ma describes as, quote, the alert curiosity of a child, quote, embodying not a receptive stance that is disconnected, closed in upon itself, and mired in oblivion, but rather one characterized by wonder and receptive openness to the world. Installed on the gallery floor, the television's placement is meant to invoke the child's experience as a viewer. I invite the viewer to recreate that experience by sitting on the floor themselves while watching the work. Unable to return to Hong Kong or Shanghai or the route between these cities, I wasn't interested in reconstructing these memories through historical reenactment. Instead, a speculative approach, a metaphorical exilic journey through the American South, offered new resonance through collision with relational landscapes. Journey from North to South emerged from this urge to trace a southward exile using another place as proxy. The Mississippi Delta, rich with its own haunted history, stands in for the absent original. Yet the images of the road remain silent to these histories, of coolie migrants shipped in for labor, of indigenous displacement along the Trail of Tears, of the cotton industries built on Black enslaved labor. One is left to imagine this. While a 3-channel rack mount monitor where the video is presented is typically used in news vans or television station control rooms, the machine suggests a view of a video feed in progress or live in the making. Intuitively, the viewer may shift their gaze from one channel to another, cutting between these scenes, showing 2 different views of the road. And with its sprawling span of 22 hours, any viewer coming upon this work can only glimpse the work's totality, and one may never see the scene of the Chinese cemetery in Greenville, Mississippi. Once again, what's off-screen becomes the most essential. The title No Place emerged from a conversation with Gordon H. Chang back in 2022 at Stanford during a dinner at the IMU UR2 symposium. I asked him, sharing some of my family's mythic, fragmented, and geographically scattered histories spanning Shanghai, Hong Kong, New York, Okinawa, the Malay Peninsula. Perhaps the only thing uniting these locales is that each is a port. How do you make sense of this? What does it mean? Looking back, the question seems almost absurd. Gordon answered, he obliged me. Your family's story, it's really about no place. That phrase stuck, and in my work took on new meaning. In my writing, I expanded upon its poetic possibilities. I aim to present these stories not as an exceptional or even personal story, but to pose the challenge of how to tell stories that are not focused on the identity of a person or a group of people, but of place. How to know and view places and the fictions about place that are defined by migratory experiences and violent events. No figure is present in these films. And a child already knows the text addresses a second person, you, not a first person, I or me. No Place is not about framing a single place or even a single story as exceptional or exemplary, but about tracing a constellation of locales linked by the experience of profound forgetting. This isn't non-place in the sense of Marc Augé's anthropology, but rather a vision of real locations rendered spectral by forms of displacement such as invasion, violence, or forgetting. These are contested territories, seized ports, battlefields, contact zones, spaces overwritten by colonialism or by the Cold War, as places turned against their own memories, a kind of mirroring that creates an alternate and sanctioned past. Beyond the pedagogical goals of militant cinema, beyond research aesthetics or indexical realism, I ask, how do we center the unseen, the unarchivable? As scholar Margaret Hillenbrand asks, when nations decide to disown their troubled pasts, how does this strategic disavowal harden into social fact? End quote. That question propels this work, a search for invisible frameworks, for ways to visualize catastrophe without relying on traditional nonfiction forms. How do we imagine what remains when politically strategic disavowals of events become crystallized? I think this is essential for us to imagine other ways, especially now. No Place, the exhibition is all about seeing doubles, twinned works, the double gaze of memory and present experience, the elliptical returns of place. An ellipse is a shape with multiple focal points, and in its broader meaning, elliptical also implies incompletion, absence, disunity. I came to read No Place not as a void or a lack, but as an elliptical presence, something multivalent and constantly unstable. I'm interested in elaborating on this theme of doubles in even this live scene now. Having begun this with a screening of an image on air, this talk returns to the stage through a conversation with two figures who have been incredibly influential on my work and thinking, Gordon H. Chang and Pavle Levi. Thank you again for obliging me and being up here with me to speak about my work.
I'd like to say something right away. It struck me as you were speaking how you used the term speculative. And I think it really is so adequate to describe so much of your work. It's true of Child Already Knows, it's true of A Journey from North to South, it's also true of other films you've made. It's true of What Rules the Invisible, of The Sojourn, in that your work tends to combine these highly personal and very strongly felt stories, topics, stories that you seek to tell or retell, but always through a very strong reflection on the nature of the medium that you're working with, moving image, cinema, and the way the two come together. These felt, personal, never depersonalized narratives that pertain either to individuals or families or larger groups of people, and the way you reflect upon, you keep reflecting in a kind of speculative manner on the nature of the medium that you're using to tell these stories, is, I think, a key or one of the keys to understanding your work or appreciating your work. And what emerges for me out of that kind of doubling, if you will, is the emphasis on what the very first title we saw on the screen insists on so much. And others, of course, have said it before, but in your work, I think the invisible becomes a center. And it's rendered so interestingly because, and this is the last thing I will say for now, because the invisible here appears as a consequence of, again, a combined effect. It's not only the question of things being on screen or off screen, as the title of your book says, on and off screen imaginaries, but in an interesting way, precisely because there's always the personal, the narrative, and reflection on the medium. There's a kind of superimposition of on and off screen space at the same time. So what emerges is a kind of third space, which is very much on the screen, where the invisible is made palpable on the screen. And I think that's the kind of trigger for so much that unfolds. And I think it's incredibly rich, and that's, to me, always the start of the conversation.
Thank you, Cantor, for bringing me onto this panel, Stephanie. We were doing that earlier, mixing up our names, Bob, Stephanie, and George.
We came up with different names for ourselves before this, so we'll be referring
We
to...
learned that we are regularly
confused.
confused.
Speaking of doubles, actually, this is
Yes.
a good... I'm mistaken for when I say Tiffany, people for some reason hear Stephanie, and then people hear Bob when you say Pavle.
Bob, and they see me and they call me George.
Right.
So, and this is not just one or two, but it seems to happen with eerie frequency. So we were trying to figure out, is there some metaphysics here where we project a name, a personality that seems to provoke people to miscall us? So,
We're
And-
stand-ins for ourselves.
yeah, so it's something that's invisible. We're not quite sure how to interpret this. I'm humbled to be here. I'm a very traditional historian. That is, I work in the history department. I try to, what we call in the history department, but I'll get back to this in a moment, recover the past, try to understand the past. We do this through traditional means in our department, using documents, photographs, sound, but written documents largely, diaries, letters, newspapers, and this. And I have to say that it's been very humbling working and learning from this work, because it reminded me that historians, I hope there are no, I don't know if there are any colleagues here in the department, but I will venture forth and say, I think we have a lot of hubris as historians. We think we can recover the past, and we claim to do so. But I think as the work shows, that perhaps we do so to some extent, but the vast majority of the past is gone. We can't reclaim it. We can't document it. We can't recover it in the way most of us historians think. And Tiffany's work reminds us that so much of what's past is invisible, is forgotten, it's elusive, even as we try to reclaim it. So I'm humbled by that insight, and quite sincerely. Now, but at the same time, as in her remarks presented in her work, is that we have sort of a passion to try to reclaim the past. We can't, as humans, live without trying to reclaim the past. Whatever society, community, whether you're on some island in the South Pacific or you're on a mountaintop in Europe or something, everybody seeks history. They seek to know their past. Why do they seek to know past? Because it's so much of our identity. So I see a paradox here, that we are propelled to try to grasp this, and maybe to some extent we are comforted by the efforts that we make, whether it's through oral traditions. We talk about, some communities, as you may know, have oral traditions that can go back, these narratives that people can cite just by memory of going back generations, a couple hundred years, to reclaim the generation, the genealogy. That seems to give us some comfort, because it gives us some meaning. And I think we suspend the disbelief, suspend the knowledge that we really can't reclaim the past. So the issue is how, as I understand it, what is the effort here is how to make palpable, that's a good word, the invisible. It sounds like a paradox, it's a contradiction, but I think that's the goal. That's the ambition.
Yeah, I mean, and also I think reflecting on both of your works, we had this conversation yesterday, Gordon. You were like, I'm, so traditional in my approach in history, and there was nothing to me that's traditional about your approach. And I think even reading Ghosts of Gold Mountain, and I mean, thinking about that and Cinema by Other Means, those two books, and I'll sort of describe a bit for the audience. Ghosts of Gold Mountain is this work written about coolie laborers who were working in constructing the Trans-Pacific Railroad through the Sierra Nevadas. And in the absence of not a single primary account, not a single account from one of these workers, Gordon, you worked through various shipping manifests, from studying the board games that were shipped in, or the people who worked for the company that that shipped these coolie workers to construct this railroad. From all of these disparate missives, of history to construct try and picture the presence of these ghostly figures in our past and to see them. And there's nothing, there's something deeply about trying to make palpable the invisible. And not only the invisible of the past, but the invisible of the American infrastructure today that still lasts because of that work. And then I think in your work, Pavle, with Cinema by Other Means, and then also your more recent essay, the cinema of the cinema of ethnically cleansed landscapes, there is a deep relationship to the invisible. There is a deep relationship to thinking about, specifically even within film. I mean, you say history has sort of, historians have a sense of hubris. I think filmmakers have a huge sense of hubris around film's indexical promise to show, to illustrate. But I think in this gutter, as the gutter between the film and in the montage, Pavle locates this kind of gutter as also the space of meaning. And then also the kind of, in the absence of people in these ethnically cleansed landscapes within these landscape films, there is a palpable absence, a palpable forgetting that is on the screen as well. So that's how I was really like kind of inspired by both of your works. And I think also maybe going to A Child Already Knows for a moment, the work that's inspired by my father's retellings as a child. I was looking at different children's recollections of this particular time. And there's a book by Yang Su, I think titled very literally, it's Collective Killings in Rural China During the Cultural Revolution. And Yang Su, in the foreword of this book, describes an impetus for sort of like the kind of raison d'etre of why they were committed to writing this book, which I thought was so interesting because it had to do so deeply with the personal. Yang Su writes, violence seemed to excite the adults. So these are Yang Su's memories. Violence seemed to excite the adults. The conversations generated enormous confusion in me, for these were people whom I was intimate and whom I knew to be otherwise kind and gentle. These early memories began to present the question of how ordinary people could lose sympathy with the weak, a natural capacity that had remained in a child. So I was really moved by this and other accounts, but I think that they're inside a lot of these political questions, inside a lot of these questions, whether about cinema or history, are also deeply personal ones too. Yeah.
I first of all, thank you, Tiffany, for the very kind words. I think it's important to keep in mind that, and I think this is something that Gordon too has addressed already, and then you kind of focused on in your response, it's that the invisible, what is left invisible in an image, what is left invisible in a series of images, that which resides off screen or in the midst of the image but is somehow not accessible, is not only, and this is the paradox, I think, or to me this is the paradox Gordon was referring to, is not only something that belongs to the past, something that is an element of memory, of loss. And there are indeed so many so interesting lacunae and absences in your work, whether they're the interstices between images, whether it's the center screen as itself a kind of absent image, no image, in Journey from North to South, or in other films. What Rules the Invisible is full of these too. But the invisible the way I see it and the way I really appreciate it, because it's so inspiring to think about the work then. In your work, the invisible is coextensive with the imaginary. So what you don't see literally as given by somebody, a filmmaker, an author, an artist, as an image, is both something that you try to evoke in reference to your own or, group memory, recollection, etc., but it's also something that is being generated on the spot that pertains not so much or only to the past, but also to the future. And as such, it's actually what empowers, what creates agency. I feel that the two works on display here and your other work again, it all revolves around precisely a certain sense of agency that emerges out of using the cinema, the art of the visible, as actually the art of the invisible. So there's always a film within the film. And in that sense, I think it's so interesting that, again, both works on display here and your other works very often take or partake of the genre of road movie. There's constant movement of various vehicles that is being either literally presented or evoked. In Journey from North to South, we have the two views, the kind of shot, not shot and counter shot, but two angles on highways and their surrounds from a moving car. A Child Already Knows is a train journey. The lesson of this, I think, or a lesson of this, is that the window as a screen, is the frame, is a best substitute for the movie screen, and vice versa. Movie screen is the best substitute for a window of a vehicle. And this opens up the space for kind of endless play of images substituting for each other. And this is where the invisible comes in, because Child Already Knows is a great example of what you would imagine a child could see while seated in the car of a train, but somebody is constantly substituting the kind of missing landscapes of what's actually happening, the family fleeing from north to south, substituted by these proxy images of cartoons that are a children's genre, right? So there is something always that is being made visible that is actually concealing, kind of standing in for the absence of the actual imagery. And in that sense, the landscape becomes really, the missing landscape becomes not only nature that's missing, but also a social, political, historical landscape that is both being summoned and not given to literal and concrete representation. Whereas Journey from North to South does something similar. We are actually literally seeing, but we're also never seeing the world, the reality, the social dynamics beyond the highways. So again, it's a window that is also a screen that is kind of concealing its own access to what matters.
As watching Tiffany's work, I think that the kernel is a very simple one. You're trying to engage, find some way to access your father's experience from Shanghai to Hong Kong. But it's completely lost. There's no documents, there's no photographs, there's no sound, there's no interview, and that's not unusual circumstance. I'm sure every one of us in this room has family histories we would like to know, sometimes very simple ones, but we're never going to know. I have questions all the time. I think, what did my father do this or this time? Now they're long past. I'm never going to know. That makes me sad. But Tiffany's work also suggests a way out or a way forward of prompting imagination. And in some sense, all of history is recovering history or trying to access history is an act of imagination. filling in with things that we don't know. And that's fine, and maybe that's the best that we can do. I'm sure most of us have seen, or many of us seen, Finding Your Roots on television with Skip Gates. A great program, fascinating program, wonderful personalities. But that's a good example of pretty traditional genealogy, recovering personal history. And people are flabbergasted often by what they are presented, what they learn. But there is a sort of a pretext, there's a what do you call it? A suspension of belief that now I know the lineage. It goes back to Poland, or it goes back to Lithuania, or where all the places. It goes back to Gabon and Africa, all the different places. And they do terrific work looking at the traditional historical material, census figures, newspaper reports, and this type of thing. But if you step back, what do they really now know about their past? What do they really know about their great-grandfather? What was life like in this place or that place? I would like to have a little more of Tiffany's work to say, just think about it, imagine what it was like. And then some people start to think of them. I'm sure they leave the program, they go back and try to think about it. And I think that's a great value. That's something, a great contribution of yours, certainly for me. Now, I want to turn to something else about no place. And I'm quite flattered when I picked up your book, Imaginaries here, and you can hold it up. And it's a fascinating account, a fascinating collection of essays about Tiffany's work. And as I was reading it, all of a sudden I encountered my name. and I had no idea that you had been thinking about this conversation we had at a restaurant downtown Palo Alto 2 years ago. And as Tiffany mentioned, she was regaling me with her family history, which was quite complex. She mentioned all the different names of places and where the family goes and here and there. And she was not imploring me, but seeking from me some way to understand this mobility, this very complex passage of her family through so many different places. I never heard of some of the places. I don't know her family and all this, but she was looking at me, wanting me some answers. So I felt on the spot. So what do you want me to say? How do you want to make sense of your journey? And that's why, and all of a sudden occurred to me, it's no place. It's not this place, it's not that place, it's not a home place, it's not a destination place. It's all places and no place, because it's all fluid, it's in motion. And that got me thinking about the notion of place and us as humans. And I claim, I would venture forward, that all of us, I'll say that, want to seek place. In Chinese, you want to, you meet someone, what's your lao jia, what's your home village? You're going to be away, if your family's away from your home village for 200 years, but what's your home village? There's a place. And a lot of people, I'm sure that's the case. So you meet someone new, what's your place? Oh, it's St. Louis or something like that. So place is so important to our personal identity. And yet it can be really elusive. Increasingly so, and especially so. You mentioned railroad workers, you mentioned workers of various sorts, and now the world is so fluid, there's so movement, so many immigrants and people move from place to place. And I think it's an interesting question to think about, the problem we all have of place and where we locate ourselves.
Yeah, and I think a lot of these questions, instead of surrounding questions about my identity, I was really interested in casting that question specifically to this question of place. what fictions do we have about these places? What does my father know about Shanghai? And the Shanghai that he knew no longer exists. Or the Poland that somebody's family is from no longer exists. These places that we are attached to are also filled with all of these layers of fictions and things. Inside this film, if you're lucky enough, if you come on a day where you're just getting it right at that particular moment, you might see the Chinese cemetery in Greenville, Mississippi, where we stop. And it is a Chinese cemetery in Greenville, Mississippi. I'll just go through these slides. And let me, yes. So there are 2 inscriptions. So, and it's interesting because they're not translated in English. And as you can see, it's a really modest cemetery in the middle of Mississippi. And when I talk to people who are from the South, they're like, many, you know, I hadn't really spoken to many people who really knew about it. Dale Holton, who is in the audience, who has been incredibly generous with their words on my work, but also actually was advising me as I was taking this trip through the Mississippi Delta, and their family is from this region, described to me something I didn't really understand about the Mississippi Delta, which is that it itself is an imaginary. As in, the Delta is not like the Pearl River Delta or the Mekong Delta that I would understand deltas to be geographically, you know, shaped by a body of water. The Delta is a constellation made by several places in Mississippi. And within the Delta exists this cemetery hiding in plain sight, this layered history. And as you could see in this particular slide, on the one side, it's the Communist Party sort of symbol, and then on the other is the KMT symbol, the Nationalist Party symbol. And again, another really complex history hiding in plain sight. And it reminds me of this essay, this beautiful essay by Nan Zida, Disambiguation as a Tragedy. She talks about how the Chinese diaspora is not a real collectivity. She argues that the Chinese diaspora is not a real collectivity because those who did the harming and those who were harmed got mixed up, and they can't tell between us. And it becomes on the victim to make those distinctions. And I think you can say that, of course, she makes that argument about the Chinese diaspora, but I think you can also make that argument about the Iranian diaspora and other diasporas. But I think that these types of lessons about migration, about fleeing, about diaspora, and the forgetting, so much of this is about forgetting. So this is really this kind of driving force of my work, and then also in studying these places. And then the inscriptions are incredibly meaningful as well. For those of you who can read Chinese, but for those of you who cannot, on one side it says that while the clouds, this is, by the way, I worked on this translation with my mother because I was texting her on the road, and I was talking to her about this translation, and of course she was leaving me voice notes in Cantonese. So while the clouds clear, the moon is brighter, it triggers the homesick feeling of the spirit/ghost. That's what she wrote to me. And on the other inscription is, while you have a peace of mind, take it easy to accept what you perceive as home is where you settle down. I'll tell my mom that. So I was quite moved by this. This was sort of like it's sort of deeply hidden as an Easter egg in this work, in this 22-hour work.
Can I just point out something? The tombstone on the left and on the right in English, it's a little creepy. Sorry, I saw it. It looks like too. Drivers, please do not. I mean, after you just shared with us, beautiful translation, something great, meaningful. But then you have this other inscription: "Drivers, please do not turn in front of gate," which might have different levels of meaning too.
I find that it's interesting that there's only two, like really, there were only two elements that were understandable for an American passerby, an English language American passerby, Chinese cemetery, and then that particular sign only.
But this is where this image itself is a montage. And it's, I mean, depending on how you read it, you can say that it's movement towards reconciliation or a continuation of non-reconciliation. And that's precisely the kind of conflict, if you will, upon which construction of images always rests. I think in a really interesting way, this is directly, I mean, what this image here, especially as you read, Tiffany, what the inscriptions mean, in a way is what also a child already knows is all about. And not only when it comes again to the question of content and one's personal narrative or history or family history and historical events, but it's precisely about the question of what images do to us and how we perceive them and how we endlessly try to recreate them for the sake of reassuring ourselves that we are or we are not coming to terms with what they mean. And I am always struck, I'm still struck by the title of the film, which I think is so good, A Child Already Knows, because it endlessly keeps asking you, what does a child already know? Because the story is told, as you said, in second person, directly, and it's as if the child is, cinematically speaking, both the audience, the receiver of these images, and the projector, the one who's generating the images that we watch, that are unfolding. And what the child really knows when it comes to images already is that images are, to use your own terminology or language from the film, images are pried up open only once. And it's that initial experience of encountering a film or films for the first time or any kind of powerful image at a young age, very impressionable age, which then throughout the rest of your life, you hopelessly and without success try to recreate, because these images will never ever strike you the same way. And that's what I think this film is also about. And this is why I think it's so beautiful that the personal narrative and personal history is fed through this problematic of impossible to recreate encounter with images. And thus the endless substitutes. Cartoons, puppets, puppetry, locomotion. There's something very uncanny about all this, because they are and are not working as substitutes.
For another thought, as I was watching your work, it occurred to me that I had certain assumptions about what I should or would see on film. This goes back to media. And I reflected on myself as well, when I see film, I think I'm going to see something. I'm going to see something real, something documented, because that's how we live. We see photographs, we see TV, we see all this type of thing. We think if it is on film, it is somehow real. But you're adamantly, this is not documentary. adamant that it is art, and it is. But I think certainly I was unclear about this at first until I was engaged with the work and began to see it, that Tiffany's work is art. It's not documentarian effort. And so when we think about art, I mean, art can be done in so many different ways. But how does this presentation of an artistic sensibility, an artistic vision, artistic aim be realized in a form that seems so familiar to us?
Yeah, and I think on that, I'm driven by believing that cinema, film, video is one of the most intoxicating mediums. Intoxicating for us all, a medium that no one can escape from today, especially. A medium that nobody has distance from, that we are unable to have distance from the types of fake images that we see on our phones. It's and the kind of that requires a certain media literacy that we really have to be able to engage in a way that we're not just lost in them. And I think so much of my work is trying to think about how we encounter these images and what we think we know about these images. And of course, the film sort of presents to you these early Mao era cartoons, and you think my father would have seen these cartoons. And then about 3/4 the way through, I reveal the fact that he never saw these cartoons. He didn't have access to them at that age as a child. And in fact, only through showing that work in the gallery last year, Chinese national students would come up to me who were born in the 90s and the 2000s, and they would say, I watched those cartoons. Those are my childhood memories. So it was really interesting, this type of media memory and thinking about media and film in the same way that we think about print culture. These are material cultures that have their own histories, have tell stories of their own through their circulation, when they were circulated, when people encountered them. And then I think to kind of connect to this question of the child and knowing, I was really interested in almost this film as an kind of anti-allegory in a sense. A child is typically really infantilized in a film, sort of treated as this sort of innocent subject in a film, not treated seriously as a person who can understand so many things and perceive so many things. I get the question sometimes, what do you think a child would think if they watched this film? And it's a little bit about, it's more about like it's sort of like an adult's child film. It's like how we as adults maybe remember that weird nascent moment of becoming privy to the world of adult secrets. And that kind of threshold between the child's world and the adult world. And while the child is seen as an unreliable narrator, I think actually the child might be the most reliable narrator. Why is the child invested in lying to you? This strange memory of ice cream in a Soviet China friendship mansion. Such an odd memory, right? And so it's not some kind of loss of innocence. It's not really about that. But really thinking about who is a child that affords innocence in such a moment like that, in such a moment of history like that. So that for me was an interesting way to tell a contentious period of Chinese history in particular.
That's really interesting, but I mean, I think it's at the same time, what comes to me at least, what comes across to me in this film, child already knows, is an adult's child, but it's also a child's adult person. And that's where this idea of recognition or knowledge gained is doubly rooted, because it does not preclude, it actually allows for imagination to be made into a part of acquisition and production of knowledge. So it's not only about uncovering in some kind of straightforward documentary manner, right, the truth or how things are, but it's about generating, quote unquote, perhaps in an adult manner, by which I wish to suggest, kind of serious, responsible, mature way, knowledge, which nonetheless is the knowledge that remains deeply rooted in what the age of childhood is so soaked in, and that's imagination. And that's where the form, and that's where the artistry, the idea of packaging something, if you will, that's not the right word, I mean, forming, creating something into a series of images that are soaked in the imagination is essential. Because the imaginary is the path towards knowledge.
We take questions.
Yeah, this is such a rich conversation, but I do want to make sure that we leave time for people who haven't had a chance to see the work upstairs to see it. So I'd love to know if anybody here tonight has some questions. A question. Should be on if you just point it.
You mentioned the cartoon, so I was just wondering, did your dad tell you about that, like his memory of the cartoon, or did you? Because I see like there's a gap in time. I assume that your dad is much older than the child in the 90s. Just trying to connect that gap and try to understand the gap of that.
So the cartoons are actually from the Shanghai Broadcasting Company. And so they are a slew of different cartoons from that particular company that worked with several different animators with different styles. So I sort of appropriated that footage and reworked it and edited it into this sort of montage. And it spans from the early 50s to the late 50s. So it spans roughly his childhood and the time that he would have been in Shanghai. And even though he had access as a child to this China-Soviet friendship mansion, he didn't have access to a television, or he just never saw those cartoons. So I think that for me is actually part of the mystery of the work. I don't quite understand how he wasn't exposed to those cartoons, especially given that it seems like he would have had access to some kind of, spaces maybe adjacent to the political class. So that's all that is part of the mystery itself. And he didn't actually, in the work, and In a Child Already Knows, I talk about how his first encounter with a television was really in Hong Kong. And it was watching Johnny Carson and Laugh-In. So there's this sort of funny moment where, you expect him to be the audience of that, but no, he was an audience of Johnny Carson and Laugh-In.
Michael, can you turn the level up on mic 2 just a bit?
Tiffany, thank you for showing us the No Place video. I couldn't tell if it was 3-channel or like the void in the center. The only static image that we see is the 3 slashes. And I was wondering how you arrived at that, because to me, the slashes are how you navigate the internet, HTTP // however you kind of get into a visual domain. And I was wondering how you chose that. And also, is there a correlation between having 2 eyes and like a third eye? I don't know. It's just wondering how you arrived at that.
Yeah. The slash question is, it's an important one. I've used the slash in my writing before as a way to kind of denote a break or some kind of passage in time. But I think your association is also welcome, because in a way that's also when you're navigating the internet, you're opening a new window and you're going onto a new page. There's something about the slashes to me that connotes a threshold of some sort, a threshold in time, a threshold in space. And so I like the kind of multivalent quality it has visually. And having used it in writing in this, yes, you're correct, it's in the center screen. I've created a sort of composite here for you to view the video. But of course, when you're viewing the video in the gallery, you'll see it actually on the rack mount monitor. This is not a typical way to see the three screens move. So just a kind of caveat there, but they are also to imagine, like, you know, the image between those two images is a sort of third image, as Pavle talked about.
Thanks. This is such a rich conversation. So thanks, everybody. I want to put together three things that were said. Tiffany, you said, I'm driven by this filmic intoxication, which by extension is also toxicity, right? And then you also described the reading of a child's perspective of how they were describing something, if I remember correctly, the adults were excited by the violence. Is that right? Okay.
Yeah, the violence seemed to excite the adults.
Okay,
yeah.
Great. So I want to put these two sentences together with Gordon's observation of the invisible is palpable. So all the time that we're watching this, what I'm proposing is, on the one hand, the most prosaic, the most obvious, and on the other hand, what I think the work is doing. And that is, if the invisible is palpable, the palpability is dependent, in a sense, on a body, on a biological being. And so what we were looking at for almost all of this time in No Place is the drive, right? So I would like to just think about this idea of the drive in relationship to the violence of excitement, and also how we are driven by this intoxication. So in some ways, I think what we're looking at is in fact this palpability of the drive, how to picture, in a sense, the drive in a psychoanalytic sense. And the drive, you know, when we think of the time of the drive is not, in a sense, dependent on a linearity, right? Because it's the time of appetite. I'm hungry, I eat, I'm hungry again. And also it is the drive of aggressivity. So, you know, in Freud, we learned this, that the time, I mean, this is Chris Davis reading of Freud, but nonetheless, we have, in a sense, not just an aversion to violence, but we have an attraction to violence, right? That in some ways, violence does excite us. That everybody knows, because we occupy bodies, that we have a sense of aggressivity also in us. So in some ways, what I'm looking at, in a sense, is the picturing of the drive, which is very different from seeing the drive, right? Because you can't really see the drive, Because when you say, I see, as in, oh, I understand, I know. But to say, picture this, is to say, I'm offering you a proposal. So I just want to see if there's any responding to this idea of picturing the drive.
I just love ruminating on that particular question around the drive because the work is so deeply set within questions of attachment relating to a child's attachment in their family, a child's attachment to their guardians, but also a child's, in scaling up this idea of attachment and also thinking about security, right? The security of the child also becomes a way to think about security at the scale of a state, at the scale of the securitization and the drive of the state to create these sanctioned narratives, create these national narratives, and to censor or to create enemies of the state. And the drives of the collective to kill or to shame or to make groups of people fugitive and enemies. That particular drive and really thinking about that relation of the child as kind of embodying all of these things about attachment, we're so part of this work. It was probably, and I say it was my most personal work because in the way that I was dealing with my father's origin story, I was also kind of dealing with mine too. But in doing so, it connected to a much larger thing than any one person, than any one family. Really has to do with this essence of how we form safety for children and what are our fictions around, especially in even creating these cartoons. That's another mystery for me too. You know, children are the most desired audience for propaganda, right? They are the most desired audience for these moral tales. All of these cartoons that are sourced display some kind of moral tale. It becomes tantamount for adults to teach this child something, whatever this lesson is, whatever this moral lesson is. So I can't help but think about those lessons in a larger kind of Cold War ideological battle that shows up in the material culture of these animations.
Can I add 2 sentences? I think it's really interesting. There is definitely a connection between the invisible and, I mean, the palpability of the invisible. I think, and this is very manifest in different aspects, I think, of your work, has to do with a certain kind of carnal knowledge. This is where the body comes in, right? You experience things carnally, and I think cinema is a prime example of a place, a no place, and you will see why, where the carnal experience or carnal knowledge is acquired because the cinema is precisely a no place right before a film starts to unfold. Right before a movie begins to unfold, you're sitting in darkness, complete darkness, which is what the middle screen of Journey from North to South is. That's the place where you have the invisible, the invisibility, and you have the kind of palpability associated with carnal knowledge. I just think this is also impossible to dissociate from the imaginary, because the body, even when it's soaked in darkness, even when it's confronting the invisible and kind of haptically feeling without knowing what the image is, it's still in the register of the imaginary. maybe not concrete given images, but imaginary. So in that sense, I think, yes, haptic is carnal knowledge in cinema, connected with the drive to go on, to push further, but never without the imaginary, which is always at work. I mean, we imagine our bodies, after all, even when we don't see them. And we imagine what we are experiencing. And this is why cinema is the art, and as I think Tiffany's work so well demonstrates, the art of the invisible.
Tiffany, thanks for sharing. And I'm just wondering, how did you choose filmmaking over writing a story or writing a song or pictures or something like that to present your expression?
Well, I feel like cinema is my intellectual home. Film is my intellectual home. So that's part of it. But I think that there are lots of, I write as well, and on and off screen imaginaries. There are many things that I describe, but there are just some things that I cannot do, that I can do with sound and image, with the combination of sound and image. And as we were just talking about, the feeling that one gets when watching sound and image, the combination, the alchemy between sound and image, what that changes and stirs emotionally. I think that poetic possibility is why I'm interested in film and video, but also that I'm interested in it is because it is such a high stakes medium. It is the most compelling medium in some ways, I think, for propaganda. So again, I am attracted to the ways in which the tradition of avant-garde cinema attempts to thwart some of those forms in order to make us more conscious and critical as viewers, as spectators. So I feel that in my practice, I'm very much working towards that, working towards creating that distance and that criticality for the viewer.
Thank you so much, everyone. A Child Already Knows is 33 minutes long. So I think if we wrap up now, people will still have an opportunity to see the whole piece if they head upstairs. I'm just curious if anybody has any last closing comments before we adjourn.
I'll make it very quick. I'm not a dedicated student of Tiffany's work as Pavle is, but I've tried to learn some things about your work. And this is response to the question about why this approach. Tiffany's very interested in absence, in the disappearance, in the loss, in that which is invisible. And her other work, the little that I know, explores these themes very much, particularly, say, in political protests in Hong Kong. What is loss? What is the consequence of repression? What is things of that sort? It was very political considerations. And that's why I was surprised with your very personal, which I see as very personal here. But the connection is the idea of the invisible, of that which is lost, that which can't be easily seen. But this is on a personal level.
Anything else you'd like to close with?
It's funny because I think maybe the thing that I will close with for the audience to think about is that I've sort of lobbed this personal thing almost as a red herring to have us consider our shared experience. And I think that's the thing that's so beautiful about the cinema is that we watch collectively. We watch together. And when we watch together, each of us will encounter these things with our own memories, with our own experiences, with our own relations and relationships to these landscapes. And I've presented a kind of personal work, but in some ways it's to invite the viewer to think about their own journeys and their relationships to place.
Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight.